At 180 feet, the USS Tang settled on the seabed. Half the crew was dead. The survivors were trapped in sealed compartments. Their only hope the escape trunk in the forward torpedo room. Chief Ballinger led the next attempt. He and Clay Decker flooded the trunk until water reached their chests. When Ballinger opened the hatch, Decker pushed the buoy line upward. He followed, pausing at each knot, but Ballinger's Momsen Lung failed. He screamed and drowned. Only 9 men would eventually escape, but that night of horror began months earlier, in August 1944. August 1944. USS Tang, one of the most lethal American submarines in the Pacific, was hunting just a few miles off the coast of Japan. Commander Dick O'Kane peered through the periscope and spotted 2 large Japanese freighters. Escorting them were fast gunboats that would have made most captains break off the attack. Not O'Kane. He was the most aggressive submarine commander in Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood's fleet, a man who believed his mission was to sink as many enemy ships as possible, whatever the risk. In less than a year, the Tang had already sunk more tonnage than any other submarine in the Pacific. O'Kane switched on the loudspeakers so his crew of 87 men could hear his calm, precise orders. In the radio shack, 21-year-old Floyd Caverly listened intently to the enemy screws through his headset, timing their speed with a metronome he had bought at a music store in San Francisco. O'Kane fired 3 torpedoes at the first freighter, then 3 more at the second. The targets exploded. The Japanese gunboat was closing fast, and O'Kane ordered an emergency dive. The Tang plunged to 180 feet. Within seconds, the first depth charges splashed into the water above them. When it was over, O'Kane found Lieutenant Larry Savadkin shaken in the wardroom. They had survived the worst depth charging any of them had ever experienced, but worse was coming. On October 6th, the Tang steamed into a ferocious typhoon. Waves estimated at 95 feet crashed over the submarine. The boat rolled to 70 degrees and hung there, seemingly about to capsize. O'Kane had recently broken his left foot in a fall down an open hatch and was hobbling around in agony, but he made his way to the control room to issue orders. The storm raged for hours. Men wedged themselves between bulkheads and bunks to keep from being thrown around. Bill Leibold, the chief boatswain's mate, had weathered a typhoon before on an old destroyer and knew they were in serious trouble. O'Kane gave the order to turn the Tang into the seas, a maneuver that risked capsizing if a wave caught them broadside. The boat swung over as a massive wave struck, but somehow she righted herself. For 5 long hours, the Tang's steersman fought the wheel as the submarine rode out the storm. When the barometer finally rose, indicating they were moving away from the typhoon's heart, the exhausted crew knew they had survived. O'Kane ordered full power toward the Formosa Strait, the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. He was determined to make up for lost time. On October 11th, just 2 hours after the Tang reached her patrol area in the Formosa Strait, lookouts spotted a modern diesel freighter. O'Kane ordered a submerged attack. At dawn, he tracked the target through his periscope and fired 2 torpedoes. Both hit. The Josho Maru exploded and slipped below the waves, stern first. The Japanese attributed the loss to a mine, and the Tang continued undetected. Later that evening, O'Kane sank the cargo ship Oita Maru with a single torpedo aimed at her engine room, sending a pillar of fire skyward. Japanese shore batteries opened fire, but they were shooting at Phantom aircraft, still convinced that American bombers from China were responsible for the destruction. O'Kane was happy to let them believe it. The Tang moved down the coast, and late that night radar detected a large target. When O'Kane reached the bridge and peered through his binoculars, he saw green and red side lights on a white hull emblazoned with a red cross. It was a hospital ship. Someone on the bridge suggested they sink it. O'Kane refused. There was a line he would not cross, no matter how much he wanted to destroy the enemy. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. On October 22nd, the Tang made contact with a heavily escorted convoy designated U-03. O'Kane tracked it through the night, waiting for his moment. Around midnight, one of the Japanese escorts left the convoy to make a search. O'Kane seized the opportunity and ordered 2/3 speed. By 1:30 in the morning, the Tang was in position to strike. O'Kane climbed to the bridge alongside Bill Leibold, whom he trusted as his extra pair of eyes. He fired torpedoes at a large tanker, scoring direct hits. Explosions lit the sky, and shock waves rocked the Tang. O'Kane was not finished. He prepared a stern shot at another target. Suddenly, Leibold grabbed him and almost dislocated his shoulder. A Japanese ship was bearing down on the Tang, coming in to ram. O'Kane had not seen it. He ordered emergency speed and right full rudder. The Tang cut across the approaching ship's bow with only yards to spare. Japanese sailors on deck opened fire with rifles and pistols. Then O'Kane saw an out-of-control freighter headed straight for the same Japanese ship. The two vessels collided in a rending crash of tortured steel, and O'Kane's torpedoes hit the Wakatake Maru, blowing it apart. The entire battle had lasted less than 10 minutes. The Tang had sunk all of the convoy's cargo-carrying ships and severely damaged an escort. Japanese escorts, panicked and confused, had opened fire on each other. Floyd Caverly would later say that O'Kane was quite the marksman. The crew buzzed with excitement as the Tang slipped away into the night. But only a few torpedoes remained, and O'Kane knew the next contact might be his last chance. Late on October 24th, radar blips appeared again. Another convoy. O'Kane ordered the Tang to close the distance. Soon the screen showed targets galore. He decided to attack from the surface. Just after midnight, the Tang maneuvered into position. O'Kane fired at 2 freighters and a tanker. Explosions followed, and the tanker erupted into a massive fireball, lighting up the sea as if it were day. Japanese escorts began concentrating their fire on the Tang, and machine gun bullets splattered in the water around them. O'Kane ordered emergency power, and the Tang moved away at 23 knots, her engines thundering. But he did not break off the attack. He was going back to finish off a crippled transport he had seen dead in the water. The torpedo mechanics pulled the last 2 Mark 18 electric torpedoes from their storage racks and loaded them into the forward tubes. All 22 torpedoes fired so far had hit their marks perfectly. O'Kane ordered the Tang to close on the transport. At 900 yards, he gave the order to fire. The 23rd torpedo hit its target. The transport exploded and sank. Only 1 torpedo remained. O'Kane called for a time check. It was 2:30 in the morning on October 25, 1944. Lieutenant Larry Savadkin set the final firing angle on the torpedo data computer. O'Kane gave the order. Lieutenant Frank Springer pressed the firing plunger. The 24th torpedo left the tube in the forward torpedo room. Pete Narawansky slammed his fist into his palm and shouted, heading for the Golden Gate. Then Bill Leibold, scanning the water with his binoculars, saw the torpedo broach and begin to porpoise. It made a sharp turn to port and began to come about, heading straight back toward the Tang. O'Kane shouted for emergency speed and right full rudder. The Tang was moving at 6 knots. The torpedo was moving at 26. Leibold watched as the torpedo headed directly for them, then lost sight of it as it passed down the port side. There was a massive explosion somewhere between the maneuvering room and the after torpedo room. The Tang lurched violently. Men were thrown across compartments. The after section flooded almost instantly. The submarine began to sink by the stern, settling at a steep angle. Clay Decker in the control room saw water gushing down through the open hatch from the conning tower. Decker knew they had to act fast. He climbed onto the chart table, reached up and pulled a manual lever to flood the forward ballast tanks. The bow dropped slowly and the Tang settled on the seabed at 180 feet. The explosion had killed as many as half the crew instantly. Those still alive were trapped in sealed compartments, their only hope the escape trunk in the forward torpedo room. In the conning tower, Larry Savadkin found himself in an air pocket as water rose around him. He filled his lungs, swam upward through the darkness, and broke the surface. He was the first American ever to survive a free ascent from a sunken submarine. But for the men still trapped below, the nightmare was just beginning. The forward torpedo room of the USS Tang was now a tomb. 40 men were crammed into the cramped space, their lungs burning from poisoned air and toxic smoke that seeped through the bulkheads. The emergency lights flickered weakly as more water dripped into the dying batteries below. Lieutenant Henry Flanagan took command. He ordered the men to distribute the Momsen Lungs, the breathing devices that offered their only chance of survival from 180 feet down. 4 men climbed into the escape trunk first. Among them was young Lieutenant Mel Enos, loaded down with pistols and bandoliers, ready to fight his way to China. They sealed the hatch and began to flood the trunk with seawater. The pressure rose. It became agonizing to breathe. When the outer door opened, Enos did not wait for the buoy line. He dived out into the darkness and disappeared into the superstructure. The men below heard frantic banging, then silence. Enos had drowned, lost in the space between hull and deck. Chief William Ballinger took charge of the second attempt. Clay Decker climbed into the trunk with him, along with Henry Flanagan and Ensign Basil Pierce. They flooded the chamber until the water reached their chests. The pressure was crushing. Ballinger opened the hatch and Decker pushed the yellow wooden buoy through. He counted the knots on the line as it slithered upward. 100 feet, 150, 180. The buoy had reached the surface. Decker followed the line up, pausing at each knot to let his body adjust to the decreasing pressure. When he broke the surface, he saw Ballinger a few yards away. The chief was screaming, vomiting blood. His Momsen lung had failed. Perhaps its discharge valve had been pinned shut, preventing air from escaping as he rose. Ballinger thrashed wildly, then slipped beneath the waves and drowned. When the trunk was drained, Flanagan was pulled out unconscious. Pierce had lost his nerve and refused to try again. Flanagan eventually revived and climbed back into the trunk with Narawansky and De Silva in a later escape group, while Pierce remained below. Narawansky went first, followed by Flanagan and then De Silva. De Silva rose slowly, counting each 10-foot pause, and broke the water exhausted but alive. Together with Decker and the other men who had surfaced earlier, they formed the group of survivors from the Sunken Tang. 9 men in total would escape from the submarine, an achievement no American submariners had ever accomplished before. Not all who surfaced survived. Pharmacist's mate Paul Larson came up last. The Iowan had stayed below as long as possible, treating the wounded, until the smoke and heat drove him to the trunk. He surfaced in terrible condition. Blood ran from his ears, his nose, his mouth. The bends had savaged his lungs. Narawansky and De Silva pulled him to the buoy and tried to keep him afloat, but he was already slipping away. After a few minutes, he stopped breathing. On the bridge, O'Kane was washed overboard as the Tang submerged beneath him. He surfaced, gasping, found a wooden door floating in the wreckage, debris from one of the ships he had sunk hours before, and clung to it. Dawn broke over the Formosa Strait. The sky lightened to gray. Japanese sailors aboard the patrol boat P-34 lowered a lifeboat and began rowing toward the exposed bow of a sunken freighter. They spotted 2 heads bobbing in the water. Caverly and Leibold were hauled aboard, too cold and exhausted to resist. The Japanese coxswain looked at them and asked a single question. "Doitsu ka? Are you German?" Caverly, thinking fast, raised his arm and said, "Heil Hitler." The Japanese seemed satisfied. They had picked up German sailors, not Americans. The lifeboat continued its search. Soon the sailors spotted a man lying on a wooden door. It was O'Kane. Leibold and Caverly leaned over and pulled their captain aboard. "Good morning, Captain. Do you want a ride?" Leibold said. The coxswain heard the word captain and understood. He gestured for O'Kane to sit in the stern, the place for officers. The lifeboat returned to the P-34 and was hoisted aboard. A few hundred yards away, another boat picked up Larry Savadkin, who had been splashing and yelling to attract attention. The Japanese continued searching. They found 5 men clinging to a yellow wooden buoy: Decker, De Silva, Narawansky, Trucke, and Flanagan. Larson's body floated nearby, already dead. Howard Walker, the steward whose nose had been smashed when the door burst open in the forward torpedo room, surfaced far from the buoy. De Silva tried to swim to him, but Walker slipped beneath the water and was gone. The Japanese sailors hauled the survivors aboard. One of them tried to pull the buoy from the water, but it was anchored to the submarine far below. After several tugs, he cursed and gave up. As Decker climbed the rope ladder to the P-34, he looked back and saw the Japanese sailors dumping Larson's body over the side of the lifeboat. 9 men from the USS Tang were now prisoners of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Their escape from the deep was over. A new nightmare was about to begin. The 9 survivors of the USS Tang were pulled from the water and taken first to Formosa, where their ordeal as prisoners began in earnest. They were beaten, blindfolded, and paraded through the streets before being locked in cells and interrogated through the night. One Japanese officer threatened beheading. Another swung a sword at Floyd Caverly's head, striking him flat-sided rather than with the blade. By early November, they were transferred to a secret naval intelligence center south of Yokohama, a place the prisoners called Ofuna. There they were classified as special prisoners, not registered with the Red Cross, not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention. Ofuna was a U-shaped compound with guards' quarters at the center and wooden barracks on either side. The guards carried clubs shaped like baseball bats made from cherry wood, and they used them often. On the survivors' third day, the Japanese demonstrated what would happen to men who did not cooperate. They dragged out Lieutenant Commander John Fitzgerald, captain of the sunken submarine Grenadier, and beat him unconscious as the new arrivals watched. Floyd Caverly vomited at the sight. Winter brought freezing temperatures, and the men had only thin cotton uniforms against the cold. Beriberi, a crippling disease caused by severe malnutrition, and B vitamin deficiency, swelled their joints. Jaundice yellowed Dick O'Kane's eyes and turned his skin a sickly hue. Larry Savadkin could barely walk. The daily ration was half a cup of rice and a bowl of watery soup. In early spring, Bill Leibold and Floyd Caverly discovered a locked storeroom while cleaning a passageway. Through a gap in the sliding door, they saw stacks of Red Cross packages, cases of food that had been withheld from the prisoners. They staged a fight, Leibold shoving Caverly into the door to knock it off its track. The guard broke them up and cursed, but the door had been loosened. A few nights later, the two men crept back, lifted the door free, and stole several boxes. Word spread, and other prisoners began doing the same. The Japanese discovered the theft and lined up every man. For hours, no one confessed. The guards took turns beating each prisoner across the buttocks with the cherry clubs. Not one man broke. Eventually, the guards relented. In April, the Tang survivors were transferred to Omori, a camp built on a small island in Tokyo Bay. They were put to work clearing bomb rubble from the ruined streets of Yokohama. American B-29s filled the skies almost daily, and the prisoners ducked into ditches as shrapnel pinged off the barracks' roofs. On August 15th, the men heard Emperor Hirohito's voice over a loudspeaker, speaking in a strange, formal language they could not understand. They saw the faces of the Japanese guards, slack, defeated. The war was over that night. Drunken guards stumbled through the compound, waving swords and shouting that they would kill all the prisoners. A sympathetic guard handed O'Kane a hammer and nails and told him to barricade the door. "I'll protect you with my life," he said, "because that is my duty." The 9 men nailed the door shut and waited through the dark hours, listening to the threats outside until dawn came and the shouting stopped. Days passed. American B-29s roared overhead, but now they dropped supplies. Not bombs. 55-gallon drums of food and vegetables crashed into the compound. The men scrambled to gather the cargo, stuffing themselves with real food for the first time in nearly a year. O'Kane was too weak to join them. Jaundice had turned his skin yellow, and beriberi had swollen his joints until he could barely stand. On August 28th, lookouts spotted destroyers on the horizon. They flew the stars and stripes. Commander Harold Stassen led a task force straight into Tokyo Bay. Higgins' boats roared toward the Omori beach. The men saw them coming and began to shout. Some wept, others just stood and stared at the American flags snapping in the wind. It was real. The Japanese commandant met Stassen on the beach. He was a tall man, 6 feet 4 inches, and he refused to release the prisoners. He had no authority from Tokyo, he said. Stassen grabbed the commandant by the front of his tunic and lifted him off the ground. One of Stassen's officers stuck a revolver in the commandant's face. "This is your Tokyo," the officer said. The commandant relented. The evacuation began immediately. O'Kane was carried to a litter. He weighed 88 pounds. A doctor looked at him and said he would not make it. O'Kane found the strength to argue. He had come this far, and he was not staying. He was taken aboard the hospital ship USS Benevolence. On September 2nd, the Japanese signed the formal surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. The 9 survivors of the Tang were coming home. In the autumn of 1945, the 9 survivors of the Tang returned to the United States. Dick O'Kane weighed just 88 pounds, his skin yellowed by jaundice, his body ravaged by beriberi. He spent 6 weeks recovering in Pearl Harbor, then months more in a naval hospital in New Hampshire. In March of 1946, he stood in the White House with his wife Ernestine and their children as President Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. O'Kane stood tall and proud that day, but his thoughts were with the 78 men who had not come home. Larry Savadkin remained in the Navy after the war, eventually commanding his own submarine, the Sabalo. Jesse De Silva returned to civilian life in Los Angeles, where he married, raised 3 children, and later served as president of the National Association of U.S. Submarine Veterans of World War II. Executive Officer Frank Springer drowned in the conning tower. His Navy Cross was awarded posthumously. O'Kane recovered fully and later wrote 2 best-selling books, but the weight of survival never left him. Clay Decker gained custody of his son Harry after his wife had remarried. He later attended the San Francisco party that Pappy Boyington had promised during their darkest days. Henry Flanagan died of a brain tumor in 1957. Hayes Truckee drowned in a swimming accident in 1981. Pete Narawansky died of a heart attack on the same February morning in 1994 as his captain, who succumbed to pneumonia at age 83. Floyd Caverly and Bill Leibold remained close into old age. The last 2 survivors of the Tang, and in 1998, an Aegis-guided missile destroyer named the USS O'Kane slid down the ways at Bath, Maine, with O'Kane's widow Ernestine looking on. To the end of his life, O'Kane carried what his daughter Marcia called tremendous survivor's guilt. He had not gone down with his boat, and he never stopped asking himself why so many had perished while he lived. In his final years, when Alzheimer's clouded his mind, the sound of foghorns would transport him back to that October night in 1944. He would grab his daughter's arm and pull her toward the ocean. "We have to go," he would say. "We have to go save them. If you have family stories from World War II, stories of survival or service that have been passed down through the years, we would be honored to hear them. Share your memories in the comments below. And if you value the telling of these histories, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us continue to bring these stories to light. Thank you for listening, and thank you for keeping faith with those who serve.